Nigel Chapman holds a BSc and an MDiv, and he's a software engineer and a former secretary of Surry Hills Baptist Church in Sydney. He is was the editor and lead author of the ISCAST Discussion Paper under discussion. I must confess I was a contributor to that discussion paper and I wrote several sections of it. Fortunately, Nigel, and I think Chris and others, rewrote what I wrote and made it far more accessible, understandable and clear. So please welcome Nigel.
Wow. As noted, I was the editor and lead author of the 2022 ISCAST discussion paper on Christian belief in conspiracy theories. You can find that at iscast.org/conspiracy. Many of the people who were involved in it, about a dozen of us, we had mostly seen conspiracy theories cause problems in churches, families, other relationships. So we did a lot of reading in the literature summarising it. I want to pick out just 3 things that might be quick, easy to understand, and actually useful for that sort of problem. These ideas are the idea of mainstream knowledge, the idea of mistrusting the mainstream and mainstream knowledge, and specifically the Christian ethical question of accusations and slander. These are easy things, and they get right to the heart of the issue. The first idea is mainstream knowledge. Now, I use the terms mainstream and fringe because they're really obvious and everyone feels like they know what they mean. Mainstream is normal society. Fringe is people who reject the mainstream and are normally stigmatized in some way for doing so. It's denialism, alternative medicine, racism and extremism, fundamentalism, cults, conspiracy theories. That's the fringe. Now, the mainstream contains our institutions of public knowledge. That's the public services that are trusted to tell us what's real. Science and research, universities, public health, journalism, judiciary. They all have rules and norms that produce knowledge and filter out errors. So you'll know how this works for science. For journalism, it mainly happens through journalistic codes of ethics. Oh, okay. Sorry. Now, Jonathan Rauch calls this phenomenon open-ended depersonalized checking by an error-seeking social network. Now, one of the ways those of us who work as experts and authorities in public institutions can help inoculate churches against the bad effects of conspiracism is to speak in churches and just explain how knowledge really is formed and what the people who work in the fields consider the real problems to be, because that sort of creates a real understanding of how things work rather than the abstract concerns that conspiracism can build upon. It creates rapport and trust. Second idea I want to suggest builds on this. It is mistrust, and specifically mistrust of mainstream knowledge. COSAC is a UK academic. He writes that conspiracists prefer sources that are, among other qualities, speculative. Oops, I've hit the wrong button. There we go. Sources that are speculative, contrarian, esoteric, and amateur, in preference to mainstream sources. Now, the reason sources like these seem important, valuable, critical, is that they mistrust the better credentialed sources. Mistrust explains why conspiracy theorists feel inside. They don't understand immunology to an introductory college level, but they do understand that big pharmacology firms could take shortcuts with vaccines. And that feels like wisdom, common sense. Mistrust explains why the best predictor of belief in conspiracy theories is already believing in other ones, because once mistrust is learned, it's easy to reapply it. Mistrust explains why conspiracism appeals to people who are in conflict, have a history of oppression, are losing social power, or see themselves as persecuted. They have real reasons for mistrust. Mistrust explains the political conspiracism of the past decade, because mistrust of enemies drives polarization, and mistrust of elites drives populism. And both movements eagerly share conspiracy theories about their opponents. And finally, mistrust explains why Christians have such trouble finding simple moral answers to conspiracism, because mistrust is ethically ambiguous. It is good when it's justified, and it's bad when it's not. And figuring out which is which may not be a simple question. The third and last idea I want to suggest is that Christians have some ethical common ground between those of us who believe in conspiracy theories and those of us who generally doubt them. Conspiracy theories seek justice and truth. I walked past St Mary's College this morning, and the logo on the front said they were about seeking truth and doing justice. It's a standard part of Christian ethics. What we often see instead when we encounter problems arising from conspiracism is slander and partiality, foolishness and conceit, rage and strife. These are things which directly undermine the aims of justice and truth and Christian faithfulness, which may be why people are motivated to promote conspiracy theories. If we take slander, for example, if you distrust public institutions in a systematic way, then you are very likely to start making accusations against other people, especially public officials. Patrick Stokes is a Melbourne-based philosopher. He writes, "Engaging in conspiracy theorizing involves a willingness to entertain and multiply accusations." He says that accusations incur a moral debt which must at some point be paid for with evidence. Now, this should resonate with Christians. If a Christian does not care whether they are making false accusations or not, and does not try to make things right if they find they have done so, then something is wrong. We can inoculate churches against destruction from conspiracy theories by teaching about these kind of counter-values which oppose them. So the values that oppose slander, bias, foolishness, rage and strife. Questions?
Yes, thanks for your talk.
Yeah.
I know that you would be called mainstream, because if I'm in Russia, the mainstream is different to here. If I'm in Iran, it's different. That's mainstream to them, is where they are. Mainstream now also include accepting gender dysphoria as a legitimate lifestyle choice. In fact, enforcing other people to accept that. So I have a problem with it being called mainstream here as the gold standard and the way we should sort of go. Because I think there's always a need to question and push against what is mainstream, or else we don't advance in any way at all.
Yes, especially under, in American politics in the last 10 years, there's been a phenomenon of mainstreaming of the fringe as well, where fringe movements grow in size until they become their own localized mainstream. So it's an approximation, but the dynamics of fringe movements versus the wider society in which they exist is something that's well enough understood generally to be
Well, as Christians, the fringe movement nowadays in Australia, so I think we have to see ourselves as such.
Yes.
I contributed to your book as well, and an excellent.
calling it a paper. Everyone's calling it a book.
The question I've got is to do with inoculation. I think we sort of cross-swords a bit on this already. I think you talk about a weakened form of whatever the theory is. But I mean, in my own particular area, so people say that 5G causes COVID virus, makes it spread or something. How do you construct a weakened form of that? It's just, Brendan Murphy said it's rubbish. How could you construct a weakened version of some of these theories?
I'm not. One of the theories with inoculation is that it's you need to give examples of the wrong forms of thinking. One application of that is, say, you give easy versions of, say, anti-vax arguments in order to prepare people to receive more serious ones that they'll encounter in regular life later on. I think inoculation is actually quite a bit broader. I mean, it needs sort of a reason for covering sort of the idea of what the mainstream knowledge is, which fringe knowledge rejects, is that you can make a positive account of why science and medicine comes to these views through the public process of persuasion and critique. And that can then be contrasted with, that's a sort of a strong basis from which to then engage with fringe views.
Yes. Yes, you go ahead.
Just a question, could you give an example of how you deal with, a Christian friend within a small group who has, I'll give you a practical example. My husband and I are both climate activists, climate change activists, and we have someone in our small group who's a great person, but totally denying climate change. Great person on a getting to know him level. And I'm sure the motives are like tribalism and probably a deep distrust of scientists, which he probably equates with atheists. But I'm just speculating. So on a practical level, does the rest of the small group gang up on him and try and convince him? Or do have you had experience of just talking to people who otherwise are quite rational but just have this blind spot?
I guess there are two questions there. There's having different opinion and recognising that differences of opinion, whether either side views the other as legitimate or not, they're not things that necessarily need to affect behaviour. So if it happens that our difference of opinion is causing us to be unable to get on with each other or to be really angry with each other, or to, frankly, to mistrust each other, because the mistrust sort of expands all the time, then we can deliberately look at that and say, okay, are we going to allow this difference of opinion to interfere with our social life together? If we're operating from within a Christian framework, then I think something like how Paul tells people in his churches to agree with each other. I mean, he's not saying that that any opinion is right so long as it's shared, saying that you ought to do the work of actually understanding and working out how to get on with each other. And I think that's the kind of problem that conspiracism blows up into. It's a separate problem that exists on top of it. And there are a lot of Christian resources for dealing with that behaviour.
So I think we are breaking for lunch now. The other people have got out, so unless we break first, we'll end up starving and they'll eat all the food.
So you have questions?
Yeah, I'd encourage you to bring questions to Nigel afterwards. Thank you.